be French fries, human French fries.
No, we are not going to be French fries.
We've talked about the loose definition of based on a true story, but what happens when that movie's based on what may not even be entirely factual to begin with? This can happen with movies like The Possession, which was based on an internet article that someone fleshed out into a story when they thought the thing they bought was cool. Other times a movie can be merely inspired by an event, even when they don't credit that event in the film's credits. Think A Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven read articles about a bunch of people dying in their sleep and even being afraid to go to bed, and he expanded on that with Freddy Krueger and the rest of the story.
This is God.
In fact, speaking of Wes Craven, that wasn't the first time something inspired one of his movies. The Hills Have Eyes was made after he read about a proposed famous Scottish cannibal, Sonni Bean, and how civilized people could become savages. Just a heads up, while I personally prefer the 2006 remake slightly, we'll be discussing the 1977 original, as it was the one originally inspired by the famous cannibal, where the remake blames nuclear testing. Make sure you don't get lost in the desert as we find out what really happened to The Hills Have Eyes. Wes Craven got his start with the famous and infamous The Last House on the Left. It would be derided for its violence and brutality, and 50 years later, it's still an uncomfortable watch. Sean S. Cunningham would make the movie with him, and the two would go on to separately create two of the most enduring slasher villains of all time with Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger. After Last House, however, Craven would go a few years without making anything, and when he did, it would be an adult movie that he directed under the name Abe Snake. That sounds like an adult film actor even more than it sounds like an adult film director, if we're being honest. 2 years later, he would get The Hills Have Eyes. Peter Locke, one of the producers on Last House, was interested in another horror movie as they could be quite profitable and inexpensive to make. Sure enough, it was made for around $700,000, but it would pull in $25 million at the box office and become a certified hit. It would spawn a sequel that has the greatest flashback sequence of all time. It's the dog. A freaking dog has a flashback. And years later, it would get the remake treatment, with that remake also getting a sequel. Written and directed by Craven, he would base the short story on Scottish cannibal Sonni Bean while taking his celluloid influences from the Grapes of Wrath and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They filmed in the Mojave Desert, and the crew had quite the pedigree. Many of them were veterans of Roger Corman movies and knew how to make a movie on a low budget, and their production designer was the same man that did production design for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It was extremely hot, and nobody was particularly happy at the beginning of the shoot, but Craven hyped everyone up and they eventually believed in him and his project. The two most recognizable stars are Dee Wallace and Michael Berryman. Dee Wallace began acting in 1974, and 50 years later, she's never really slowed down. She has 274 credits to her name, but genre standouts like Critters, Cujo, E.T., and The Howling trump anything else on her resume. This was early on in her career, but she already had what fans appreciated her bringing to the table role after role, and she doesn't seem likely to slow down anytime soon. Berryman had already appeared in the Jack Nicholson juggernaut One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but was thrilled to be in a horror movie because he fell in love with them after watching The Mummy's Curse from 1944. The first time I saw him was Weird Science, and he's made a career of leaning into his unique looks rather than shying away or being embarrassed by them. Kudos to you, sir. By all accounts, he seems like a sweetheart and continues to work today. The movie opens with a wild woman named Ruby trading with a local man named Fred. But Fred says that the little she is getting is all she'll get now, and they won't be trading anymore. The local authorities and even the Air Force have been snooping around. Fred is leaving, and Ruby wants him to take her with him. They discuss a family of sorts that seems less than normal when a new family interrupts them to get directions and supplies on their way to Los Angeles. The family is the patriarch and matriarch, Ethel and Big Bob, Brenda, Bobby, Lynn, Doug, their two dogs, and Katie. Bob is a recently retired police officer, and Fred warns them not to go deeper into the desert, but they ignore him and head off anyway, even when Doug overhears a strange conversation with Ruby and an unnamed man. Okay, so this will mostly be an exercise in what supposedly happened in the 16th century and how it inspired the movie. Craven didn't go about to make a historically accurate account of what Sonni Bean was. He wanted to tell a story involving people that went crazy in isolation and did terrible things. The family at the heart of Hills Have Eyes is an almost devolved set of cannibals who trap people and eat them while stealing supplies. Sonni Bean left his job as a ditch digger, something his father was too, and married a woman who was by all accounts vicious and by some accounts a witch. They went away together and found an isolated cave, somewhat like the family in our movie, and built a family together while discovering the apparent joys of cannibalism. The family continues their drive, but is startled by a jet and veers off the main road to become stranded. Bob decides to go back to the place they stopped for help to see if Fred can do anything for them, while the mysterious mountain family looks to make traps and capture them. One of the family dogs, Beauty, runs off after something with Bobby in pursuit. Beauty catches up to one of the family members, but unfortunately she's killed and Bobby makes it back to the rest of the family by nightfall. Big Bob makes it back to Fred's place, only to find him hanging by his belt. He helps him down, and Fred explains that Bob and his family are far from safe, as there's something out there. Fred and his wife lived out here when it was a booming town, but then they had their second child, a son. There was something wrong with him. He burned the house down with his sister in it, and then after he left him out in the desert, he took a wife from a prostitute and started a family. Fred is killed by his son, and Bob flees only to get captured by who we now know as Papa Jupiter. The movie does allude here to a son running off and marrying a woman of ill repute, like the legend goes, so I guess that's something. They also started their own family together, which is also part of the Sonni Bean story. Where it diverges, though, is how deep it went. While both parties fled to a cave, Sonni and Agnes produced a much larger family through incest with 6 daughters, 8 sons, 14 granddaughters, and 18 grandsons. Much like the murderous cannibals in the movie, the Bean family would wait for the evening and capture victims who strayed too far at night. They would eat most of their victims, but also pickle the leftovers in barrels while discarding other parts that wound up washing on various beaches, though nobody could identify them. We get to see the Farrell family's home and them eating the rest of the dog, and Bob is crucified by Papa Jupiter. They then light him on fire to distract the rest of the family while the cannibals look for supplies inside the RV. They take their meat from the refrigerator and eat a bird before assaulting Brenda and taking the baby. Ethel and Lynn get back to the RV and try to stop it, but Ethel is shot first, followed quickly by Lynn after injuring one of the cannibals. They flee with the baby into the night just as Bobby and Doug make it back to find their loved ones dead. They decide to go after the family as the baby was taken, and Beast, the remaining dog, kills one of the cannibals by knocking them off a cliff. Nothing here really resembles anything from the tale of the Bean family, except for them attacking and taking people back to their cave to eat. They actually went years without being found as there were no survivors to tell the authorities about the horrible cave family. Surrounding townspeople actually hung many innocent people in the search for justice, and suspected innkeepers as they were usually the last humans to see any of the travelers that went missing. How the family was eventually stopped was going after a couple where the husband was able to fight free and tell someone about them. To that end, it was similar to our story as the cave people finally messed with the wrong family. Finding out there are survivors still, Papa Jupiter decides it's time to kill them once and for all before enjoying their infant meal. Beast comes back to the family, and they also have a radio now to intercept communications between the family members. The cannibals find this out, and we get a cool speech from Papa Jupe. It's daylight now, so Doug takes Beast and heads towards the cave, with some cannibals heading towards the RV to go after Bobby and Brenda. Ruby gets a conscience and takes baby Katie to run away and give her to Doug. Brenda and Bobby use Ethel's body as a trap while Beast takes out Pluto. Don't worry though, Berryman makes it to the sequel. Bobby and Brenda are able to spring their trap on Papa Jupe and blow him up with the RV before finishing him off with bullets, and Doug is able to save Katie and kill off Mars as the movie ends on a quick stop and a red screen. The Bean family finally had their deeds catch up with them when they went after a couple on horseback. While they unfortunately were able to capture and kill the wife, the husband was trained and wily and was able to escape their clutches with the help of a large group who heard the ruckus and scared the Bean family off. Authorities sent a group to go get the family, and they found their cave with the bodies, or parts of bodies, hanging in barrels or just strewn about the ground. Depending on what version of the story you hear, the family either gave up willingly to their punishment or were buried alive in a collapsed cave caused by the group that went after them. If they were captured, they were executed via having their hands and feet cut off and allowed to bleed out for the men, while the women and children were burned. Another rumored story is that one of the daughters escaped, similar to Ruby in the story, but was hanged when it was found out that she was part of the group. The movie is based merely on the idea of a tale that Craven read, but even 46 years later, it's an effective little film. Dark, violent, mean, and unrelenting, it's still very much worth a watch. Really, all of them are worth viewing, and if you're curious about more of this tale, you can read Jack Ketchum's The Off-Season, which is based on both the Bean family and Craven's film. While there aren't really any similarities between the Bean family and The Hills Have Eyes, it's always interesting to deep dive on the horrors that come from real life.
Remakes rarely improve the original, and since we almost never remake subpar films, the comparison to the let's be honest, classic original will always be baked into the cake. It's almost nigh impossible, but here I am, coming to tell you, among the small list of remakes that outdo their predecessors, this is one of them. The Hills Have Eyes is one of the most intense, cynical tales of survival that respects Wes Craven's vision, yet expands in the right places and outdoes it in scope and execution. The 06 remake touches the third rail of horror more than anyone would have the balls to do today, and is almost an unintentional time capsule of society at the time. Listen, I love eras. I love the defining qualities of time and place. This microcosm of its time was probably the best for horror since the 1980s. I know. Since there isn't a ton of talk about it, and since I feel it's deserving of classic status, today I want to explore the new French extremity, interpretation of the American Southwest, and the evil within. So let's talk The Hills Have Eyes. Craven's 1977 movie came after his big breakout success with The Last House on the Left, and it works within its shoestring budget. The grimy and raw feel was not a character itself, but a byproduct of circumstance. And maybe that's why Wes decided to pick up Hills for the remake treatment. Of course, remakes had picked up steam, so I'm sure that was a factor. But after seeing High Tension and its bleak, grounded style, Wes knew he had found his people. Even saying,
Annie, when I wake up, it's you.
Wes was wise enough to realize the remake train had momentum and best be involved. Though, let's be honest here, by 2010 it doesn't look like he had much say. Directed by Alexandre Aja and written by Aja and writer Gregory Levasseur, and that's honestly the best you're gonna get out of me for pronunciation, guys. I'm trying. Hills Have Eyes tells a story of a family driving across the New Mexico desert on their way to San Diego, accidentally finding themselves in the territory of mutant cannibals, whom they must fight to survive. Cast-wise, we got a meek son-in-law by the name of Doug, Aaron Stanford, daughter Brenda, the great Emily DeRevin, son Bobby, Dan Bird, eldest daughter Lynn, Vanessa Shaw, Lynn's baby, the matriarch Ethel, rock star that is Kathleen Quinlan, and the manliest of men, Big Bob, Sir Ted Levine. Not knighted, of course, but sure as shit should be. In terms of a general story, this doesn't stray very far from the original. Yet, what does it take for a remake to succeed on its own? Well, 3 things. 1, respect the original. 2, innovative interpretation. And 3, strong direction with a talented cast. I'm of the mindset that when tackling previous material, it's best to go as far into left field as you can. Be unique, be your own, because the original will win almost every time. Yet here, Aja and Levasseur take the risky approach by keeping it very close to the 1977 version. But by inviting comparison, you're backing yourself into a corner. But this is where Aja shines. The 06 version doesn't shy away from some of the harder stuff in the original. Still Kill a Dog, Brenda's rape. And as a bigger budget film, I'm glad this didn't water down the intensity that came from the 1977 version, but brought it into the new millennium with guts. Literally. The biggest change, story-wise, is the cannibals themselves. Aja and company were wise to update the reasonings and their origin. Instead of inbred desert hillbillies, we have these deformed mutants, folks affected by the bomb testing, and they, like Godzilla, are the side effects we left behind, that have come back to bite society in the ass. It makes the villains that much more frightening. It makes a tough situation near impossible. The Hills Have Eyes works so well because it's taking a European feel, that being the nihilistic new French extremity from Aja, and having him, and of course Levasseur, filter and interpret it through the American Southwest. From Doug's feeble, almost satire-esque approach to guns and violence.
Leave Doug alone. He's a Democrat. He doesn't believe in guns.
To Big Bob being King Alpha, taking off his hat to pray. It's American, very much so, but ever so slightly exaggerated. upping the violence, much of which I can't show on YouTube, and giving it that unrelenting drive. Aja brings that French taboo-breaking punkness stateside. Everything becomes more stressful once the vehicle breaks down, and it goes from bad to worse to f***ed. Not to mention, Aja actually repeated a couple of his high-tension shots here. The sexual nature is very European, while the gore is grounded in brutal, sadistic realism. The mid-90s on started to soften on gore and violence. From Columbine to 9/11, we as a country were not really in the mood for a reality check. Yet, we went from Spider-Man flipping off of the American flag to Amanda digging out a key from a very alive cellmate real fast. While the French were going through their exploitation phase, we as a world came together and said,
fuck it.
I saw this in theaters, dude. I was there watching Lynn trying to save her child only to have her brains paint the wall. They kill a dog, Brenda gets and Lizard points a Taurus Model 66 in a baby's face. Again, nobody here is having a good time.
Alright, we're having a good time.
You know, the shutter speed changes, the ramp effects, the graphic gore. We as a country were angry and our horror represented that. Of course, you need a cast to handle it without fumbling. Emily DeRavin has the emotional intensity for Brenda, plus her revenge kill was absolutely needed and welcomed. Kathleen Quinlan, a legend, and gives one of the better death scenes in horror. This one I felt. Something about her needing to know everyone was safe and asking for the blanket as a, last sign of comfort.
You need anything?
Ted Levine could read the casting list and I'd be enthralled. While Aaron Stanford really goes the distance as Doug. Character-wise, if you didn't go in with the knowledge of the original movie, you would never think he'd end up as a lead. He waits until the last minute to finally defend himself. Yet his arc is complete when he gets that sweet taste of revenge. And rightfully so, they killed his wife, took his kid. I cheered in theaters, I cheered at home when he finally took charge. And is there nothing more American than when Doug uses the flag as a weapon? I damn near put my hand over my heart. Ridiculous? Yes. And brimming with hope. It's amazing. Oh, and real quick, Tom and Andy deliver a great score here. When things get messy, they do this pulsating sound with fuzz, which is both sonically pleasant, yet deeply uncomfortable. Then, for example, when Doug finally mans up, we get this big bombastic score, signifying our hero's journey. One that involves shooting and stabbing your problems away. Any movie where the dog becomes a part of the action is okay by me, and I'm glad that Aja included that from the original. An intense and visceral ride, The Hills Have Eyes is a product of a different era. As much as I'd like to believe the moniker of Masters of Horror will continue on with different directors, I believe it'll more than likely become synonymous with the golden age of the genre, and that's fine. With Wes leaving us almost a decade ago, time waits for no one and reminds us, though creatives leave,
No, baby, no. Moving on.
their work will stay with us forever. If it wasn't for Wes Craven, we wouldn't have Aja's interpretation. And so I bring it back to the master himself and all that he's done. I'm glad that in Wes's time, he got to see a proper remake of a film deeply personal to him. And for that, I say thank you, Aja, and Godspeed, Wes, wherever you are.
Every master of horror has some missteps somewhere on their filmography, and director Wes Craven had his fair share. For example, the man who gave us A Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream also brought us The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, a film made out of desperation and with ambition greater than its budget. The sequel to The Hills Have Eyes is a clunky Friday the 13th knockoff. It even has Friday the 13th music, and it's so padded out with flashbacks to the first movie that even the dog has a flashback. At least there's some good slasher kills to be seen along the way. The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 was definitely one of the low points in Craven's career. So we're going to try to figure out what the happened to this horror movie. Wes Craven made his feature directorial debut with the 1972 revenge film The Last House on the Left, a movie that was so shocking to critics and audience members, many questioned Craven's morals and sanity. So while he wanted to continue his filmmaking career, he wasn't enthusiastic about the idea of making more horror movies. His producer friend, Peter Locke, thought he should capitalize on the success of The Last House on the Left as quickly as possible. But Craven spent years trying and failing to get non-horror projects off the ground. Once he ran out of money, he finally agreed to make a horror movie with Locke. The idea was to make a low-budget film that could be shot in one location. And since Locke's wife was working in Las Vegas at the time, they figured the Nevada desert should be the location. As Locke and some other investors put together a budget of $325,000, Craven wrote the script for what would become The Hills Have Eyes, although the title on the first draft of the script was Blood Relations. Craven drew inspiration from the 16th century story of Sonni Bean, which may or may not be true, but legend has it that Bean lived in a coastal cave in Scotland with his wife, multiple children, and grandchildren. This family survived by ambushing people, killing and eating them, and keeping their belongings. When the Bean family was caught by members of civilized society, their executions were said to be brutal and torturous. So Craven crafted a script that would center on mirror families. One would be a take on the Bean family, a group of cannibals living in a cave in the Nevada desert. The other would be the Carter family from Ohio, inspired by Craven's own family, who ventured too far into the desert while on a road trip. As the cannibal family attacks and torments the other family, the more civilized people are driven to a point where they become savages themselves, and they get their revenge. Released in 1977, The Hills Have Eyes wasn't as successful as The Last House on the Left, partly because it kept being chased out of theaters by Smokey and the Bandit. But it did well enough that it got Craven's career rolling again, and it ended up making more money as the home video era began. Craven went on to make the horror movies Summer of Fear, also known as Stranger in Our House, and Deadly Blessing. Then he got an opportunity that could have been a major breakthrough for him. He wrote and directed an adaptation of the DC Comics property, Swamp Thing. Unfortunately, Swamp Thing was a box office failure and left Craven scrambling to find a job. Distributor New Realm had success releasing The Hills Have Eyes in England in 1978. When the movie reached VHS, it was a huge hit for the British video company VTC. So for a year and a half, New Realm and VTC had been reaching out to Craven and Locke, asking for a sequel, even offering to finance the project. Now that Craven had reached the end of his resources and was desperate, he and Locke agreed to make The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 for them. Craven knocked out the first draft of the script in about 2 weeks, and based on that draft, a budget of $1 million was secured. The producers were pleased with the script, but thought it should be expanded. So Craven wrote a revision that he felt would make the film bigger and better, and the producers got even more excited for the project when they saw the revisions. But they never added money to the budget. Now, Craven was stuck trying to make the bigger and better version of the script for the budget that had been put together for the first draft. That's when things started to go wrong. Craven would go on to say that The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 was a real nightmare to shoot. Craven already had a major hurdle to overcome when he was writing the script. Almost all of the cannibals had been killed off in the first movie. The leader of the group, Papa Jupiter, was dead. Oddly, despite that fact, the title on the first draft of the sequel was The Night of Jupiter. Papa Jupiter's sons, Mercury and Mars, were dead. His wife had survived, but she hadn't been involved in the action. His daughter Ruby was alive, but she had turned against her family at the end of the film. Jupiter's son Pluto had also appeared to be killed. But actor Michael Berryman had such strikingly unique features. A close-up of his face had been the main image on the poster for The Hills Have Eyes. The movie was sold on his look, so Craven decided to bring Pluto back. He was badly wounded. It had looked like his throat had been torn out by a German shepherd called Beast, but he was patched up and lived. And The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 probably would have been better off if Pluto was the only cannibalistic killer in the movie, living in the desert on his own, still using his decimated family's tactics of murder and theft to survive. But that's not the case. Pluto is not alone. Craven decided to add another cannibal into the mix. Someone who is talked up like he's the worst of the bunch. He's called Reaper, and it's said that he's Papa Jupiter's big brother. This causes a major continuity error because the history of the cannibal family was all laid out for us in The Hills Have Eyes, and there is no room for Jupiter to have a big brother. If Craven had said Reaper was Pluto's brother, another one of Jupiter's kids, and we just didn't see him in the first movie for some reason, it would have been fine. But he decided to break our brains instead. With the cannibals in place, Craven needed a new batch of civilized characters to put them up against. Although several of the protagonists from the first movie survive, he decided to bring back only 2 of them, and one just gets a cameo. In this sequel, we find that Bobby Carter, played by Robert Houston, now owns a Yamaha dealership in Burbank, California. He also sponsors a motocross team, and at an upcoming race, they'll be showing off the benefits of a new formula of gasoline Bobby has created. Problem is, the race is going to be held out in the desert, close to where the cannibals attacked Bobby and his family years earlier. Bobby is too stressed and afraid to go back out into the desert, so his wife and business partner, Rachel, tells him she'll accompany the team to the race while he stays home. By the way, Rachel happens to be Ruby, the former member of the cannibal tribe who turned against her own family to help Bobby's. Janice Blythe reprises the role, but wasn't happy with the script. She liked the idea of Ruby returning to the desert with the German Shepherd beast and crossing paths with Pluto again, but she felt there was too much going on around that. She wasn't a fan of having a motocross team with special gasoline. Robert Houston wasn't happy with The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 either, but a lot of that has to do with his own appearance. He was so appalled by the way he looks in this movie, he never acted again. Nice Guy Roy, played by Kevin Spiritus, known as Kevin Blair at the time, and Prankster Harry, played by Peter Frechette, are the racers on the motocross team. On the bus ride out to the race in the desert, they're joined by mechanic Foster, played by Willard Poe. The role of Foster was written specifically for Poe after Craven met him while doing uncredited rewrites on the 1984 action movie Toy Soldiers. John Laughlin's character Hulk is probably either a racer or a mechanic, but it's never quite clear. Either way, he's on the bus. Also along for the ride are Harry's girlfriend Jane, played by Colleen Riley, Foster's girlfriend Sue, played by Penny Johnson, and Roy's blind girlfriend Cass, played by Tamara Stafford. It's clear from early on that Cass is our heroine this time around. Craven named the character after Cassandra of Greek mythology, who could see the future, but no one believed her dire prophecies. That's because Cass has some mild psychic abilities, which don't really end up helping in this situation. Craven would pay tribute to the legend of Cassandra again years later in Scream 2. During their bus ride, the motocross team realizes that daylight savings time has ended. Clocks have been moved forward an hour, so they're going to be late for the race, unless they take a shortcut through the desert. Of course, that shortcut takes them right into the territory Pluto and Reaper have taken control of, and the bus's gas tank springs a leak on the way. The group ends up stranded on an old ranch that sits above an abandoned mine shaft, surrounded by traps that have been set by the cannibals, and Pluto and Reaper proceed to pick them off one by one. There are elements of The Hills Have Eyes that feel inspired by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the 2 films even had the same art director, Robert A. Burns. While The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 begins with a text crawl and narration, like the early Chainsaw movies did, this one feels like Craven's take on Friday the 13th. The music that accompanies these scenes of youths getting slashed up even sounds like the Friday the 13th music, which makes sense because it was provided by Friday franchise composer Harry Manfredini, who previously worked with Craven on Swamp Thing. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Manfredini's music is great, and there's fun to be had when characters are being slashed. The motocross element even allows for a chase sequence across the sand and around the rocks of the desert. Some of the best scenes involve the Cass character being stalked and chased around the ranch by Reaper, finding ways to outsmart her attacker and fight back, even though she can't see him. These scenes, matched with Manfredini's music, are so intriguing, it's enough to make the viewer wish there had been a Friday the 13th movie with a blind heroine. It'd be a lot better if that was Jason Voorhees chasing Cass instead of Reaper. There are good things in this movie, but there's also something lacking here. The script comes off as being half-baked. The dialogue is clunky. And how can you have a big guy called Hulk and give him a death where he doesn't even come in physical contact with the killers? He never has a chance to defend himself. Many have pointed fingers at Reaper as one of the big issues with the film, and not just because his existence is a continuity error. The character was played by 7'4" actor John Bloom. It wasn't until they were on set that Craven realized that putting Bloom on a motocross bike looked silly. He said Bloom made the bike look like a tricycle. It was the most ridiculous sight in the world when he actually got on this thing and his feet were hanging off. Michael Berryman was also underwhelmed by the appearance of Reaper, specifically the makeup effect that was put on his face. Speaking with Fangoria magazine, Berryman said, quote, "A lot of the story concepts in Hills 2 needed to be clarified. They never explained what happened to Pluto between the 2 movies, and we never learned where the character of Reaper came from. What the hell was Reaper, anyway? The guy looked like he had a big chunk of a baseball bat stuck to his head. It looked terrible. Craven was aware on set that things weren't working with this movie, but he didn't have time to address the issues. There was a completion bond in place. Filming had to be finished by a certain date. They could only blast their way through the script and hope to come back for reshoots later. So working on this movie was not an easy or pleasant experience. They were in a hurry, shooting scenes that weren't satisfactory. They were filming way out in the California desert, a 45-minute commute from the hotel the cast and crew stayed in. Production took place in the spring of 1983, when it could get miserably cold at night. Crew members were working hard in horrible conditions. Everyone was cranky. Berryman had serious issues with an executive producer. The project started to fall behind schedule. Peter Locke was worried, as he couldn't see how Craven was going to be able to finish filming in time. There was so much tension on set, a food fight even broke out during one lunch break, an effort to lighten the mood. Janice Blythe made the mistake of going to a salon and getting her hair cut when she had a day off in the middle of the shoot. But that wasn't the biggest problem she had on the movie. She was very concerned about a scene Craven had written for her character, a death scene. Rachel, better known as Ruby, was originally supposed to fall into a pit and be impaled on an arrow. The scene was simplified so that she only had to be filmed falling down and hitting her head on a rock. Blythe felt that either option was a bad idea. She didn't think Ruby should be killed off, as fans of the first movie would be upset if they did this. But they had to stick to the script to get the movie finished on schedule. Craven told Blythe he would rewrite Ruby's fate later, and this would be something they would fix in reshoots. For now, though, she had to hit her head on a rock and appear to die. Blythe found her own compromise. She doesn't play the scene as a death scene. When Ruby hits her head on the rock, she played it like she was just knocked unconscious. We never see Ruby again after this, but at least Blythe's performance left her fate ambiguous. Craven and his crew managed to get The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 shot on time, but the director didn't consider filming to be finished. Principal photography had been done in such a hurry, he didn't have the chance to film some shots he wanted in the movie. Scenes needed to be reworked and reshot, including the ones involving Ruby's fate. As Craven assembled the footage, he was hoping the producers would provide some extra money and schedule some days of additional photography. The extra money never came in. The reshoots Craven and Blythe were looking forward to never happened. The movie was never properly completed. All the scenes Craven wasn't happy with, all the moments he wanted to fix and do over, they're in the cut of the movie that was released to the world. The movie has a running time of exactly 90 minutes, but some padding was required to reach that length. There's the opening text and narration that was mentioned earlier, a long title sequence, and there's the element of the film that it's best known for, the use of flashbacks to the first movie. The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 has a reputation that could lead you to believe it's the most flashback-filled movie out there, aside from Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2. The truth is, there's only 5 minutes of flashbacks to the first Hills Have Eyes in this one, a reasonable amount for a 1980s slasher sequel. The problem is how the flashbacks are handled. If the footage from the first movie was just presented as a 5-minute recap at the beginning of the sequel, no one would have questioned it. Instead, Craven adds the footage into the movie by having survivors flash back to it on 4 separate occasions. 33 minutes into the movie, we're still getting flashbacks. Bobby has 2 flashbacks, Ruby has 1, and then, one of the most absurd moments in horror history, we see Beast, the German Shepherd, having a flashback to his previous encounter with Pluto. The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is best known for being the movie that has a dog flashback in it. No one was happy with how The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 turned out. But while it was disappointing to Craven and fans alike, it did serve its purpose. Thanks to distribution deals, it was already profitable before filming had even begun, and it got Craven's career back on track. When word got out that he was making a sequel to The Hills Have Eyes, it helped New Line secure funding for A Nightmare on Elm Street. And while the deal was being negotiated, the network ABC reached out to Craven about directing a TV movie called Invitation to Hell. He took the job and had just 2 weeks to prepare for the filming. Invitation to Hell aired on ABC in May of 1984. A Nightmare on Elm Street was released that November. Although The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 was shot before both of them, it didn't get a small theatrical run until August of 1985. So while it was something Craven made out of desperation when he couldn't make anything else, it ended up looking like his follow-up to the huge success of Elm Street. That definitely didn't help the reputation of the movie. It was going to be underwhelming no matter when it was released. Coming out after Elm Street made it look even worse. Despite the trouble they had on The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, Craven and Locke remained very aware that this was a property they could continue to benefit from. In 1994, it was announced that they, along with Craven's son Jonathan, were developing another sequel. Berryman was contacted about playing Pluto in the film that would be called The Outpost, The Hills Have Eyes 3. The story would take place in a government testing facility in the desert, where members of the cannibal tribe are brought to be examined for their survival skills. Locke said the script they had in place was very good, but things changed during the development process. What started out as The Hills Have Eyes 3 became an original story called Mind Ripper, and Berryman wasn't in the cast. Mind Ripper was released in 1995 and quickly faded into obscurity. As the decades went by, Craven mostly only talked about The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 to joke about it, or apologize for it. He was once quoted as saying, "I'm sorry about The Hills Have Eyes Part 2. I was dead broke and needed to do any film. I would have done Godzilla Goes to Paris." A Craven movie about Godzilla wrecking Paris actually could have been really cool. But we got The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 instead. And it's kind of fun to watch it, even if, nearly 40 years later, we still don't know where the hell Reaper came from or what happened to Ruby. It's troubled, it's unfinished. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense as a follow-up to The Hills Have Eyes, but it does have a dog flashback in it. And isn't that enough?
The Hills Have Eyes 2. No, not that one. That's The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, and has one of the greatest things ever filmed where a dog, an actual real-life dog, has a flashback, and it's just, chef's kiss. Well, I actually think the original 1985 sequel is way too much fun for its own good. It was written and directed by Craven, brings back Michael Berryman, has Harry Manfredini give us the score, and oh yeah, has a dog flashback. A dog flashback. But I'm not here to talk about that one. That one is probably so bad it's good. I'm here to discuss the true black sheep of this inbred mountain family of a film series and give you all a look at the movie that is not a remake of the sequel, but rather a sequel to the remake. The Hills Have Eyes 2 is a slept-on piece of mid-2000s horror that should be viewed with the others instead of living in its outcasted cave where it currently resides. Last month, or, whenever this video airs comparatively to that, Lance took a look at the Alexandra Aja directed remake of The Hills Have Eyes from 2006. That is a nasty piece of work that is uncompromising, mean, and at times a very uncomfortable watch. It is by far and away the best remake of Craven's films, and is a feather in the cap of the director who has a ton of great watches under his belt. And it got me thinking about this long lost to time sequel that I remember watching on video and going meh, but it did pretty decently in theaters, making almost $38 million on its $15 million budget. It brought back Craven's, both Wes and son Jonathan, to write it, and kind of relates to that original sequel that is now almost 40 years old. In that original sequel, Ruby, who is a survivor of the first film and turncoat mutant, ends up back in the desert to face off against more hills that have more eyes. That's a dumb joke, but if IMDb is to be believed, and who are we to question it, the original title of today's movie was supposed to be The Hills Have Eyes 2, The Hills Still Have Eyes. That is almost as stupendously dumb as the dog flashback. What was part 3 supposed to be? 3 Eyes, 3 Hills with a Z? I'd accept it. Anyway, the movie originally involved a survivor of Aja's movie, the character Brenda being so messed up from her ordeal that she joins the National Guard to sort out her problems. That actress, Emily DeRavin, was actually in for it, but was on mega hit Confusion Fest Lost on TV and couldn't fit it into her schedule. Craven kept the bones of the story and just had a National Guard team go into the titular hills on a mission. Our director here is Martin Weiss, who was chosen after original director MJ Bassett was unavailable. If you haven't seen Bassett's 2002 movie Death Watch, go give it a look. Weiss is primarily a music video director with only 2 other films to his name, including one that is a grim watch in, Grim Love starring Kerry Russell. The other writer besides Wes, Jonathan, the other Craven meat, is along the same lines as that director with only some music videos that he helmed, even if he did write a few episodes of the Freddy TV show and the way too stupid to be bad Mind Ripper. The acting here is chock full of solid that guy actors, so we'll just focus on the 3 main characters. Missy is played by Daniela Alonso, and in addition to headlining Wrong Turn 2 the same year as this, she's also been in The Collector for us horror fans. Apart from the genre we love, she also has done a ton of TV, including 64 episodes of Dynasty. Jessica Strout plays Amber, who is a stand-in character for what would have been the returning actor and character from the previous film. On the horror side, she would show up in both the remakes of Prom Night on the big screen and True Blood on the small screen. Finally, we have Michael McMillan as unlikely hero Napoleon. McMillan has this as his only horror movie, but was a major character also on True Blood, and has done a lot of other TV as well. So, why do I like this movie? Well, it does feel like it was written by a teenager, as all of the National Guard soldiers have sweet nicknames like Stump, Crank, Barbie, and Sarge.
I'm in fucking awe.
And there's plenty of colorful language and bloody violence.
Oh, legs asleep, dick's asleep. You wanna wake it up? Nah, it's your daddy's job.
And as we know, colorful language and bloody violence are two of our main food groups in the pyramid here at JoBlo, so that lends itself wonderfully to us. The movie opens with a fun piece of trickery, as Sector 16 is the former nuclear testing area that we saw in the first movie. We see a few scientists and a military commander get absolutely jobbed, but it does a few things right. There's plenty of gore, but we don't really see what is attacking the poor dudes. In fact, whether for budgetary reasons or a conscious choice to maintain the mutant mystery, we don't see the radiated cannibal family for much of the runtime. Some things here and there, sure, but a lot of quick cuts and near misses. When you do get to see them, it's much more impactful than it could have been. Speaking of the mutant baddies, there's a logical progression and more than just a copy-paste job that they could have gone for. While there is a giant leader who has more hit points than most final bosses in video games, and the harmless one trying to help the heroes,
You save here. Save.
there's also a few other cool ones. The one who dresses up in military garb, the chameleon one who can blend into the walls and ground due to his own specific mutation, and one just called Stabber who, well, you get it. The gore and gross factor go all in too. From the rather disgusting birth scene in the beginning and its thematically relevant sexual assault of Missy near the end of the movie, to bayonets going into eyes and a scientist crawling out of a porta potty to attempt to warn them only to die what I assume is from disgust. Or like sepsis, I don't know. Can you imagine though? He's all cut up and definitely got that stuff in his raccoon wounds. The movie's plot, on the other hand, is rather predictable and boilerplate, unfortunately. After we see the scientist and lead military guy bite it in the beginning, we're introduced to our ragtag group who fails their training mission that is presented to us as a real-life operation.
A stunning display of individual and group stupidity.
Of course, their commanding officer riles them up and tells them how ill-prepared they are, and of course that same leader is gunned down by friendly fire by one of the troopers who then feels guilty about it until he too dies. They proceed to get picked off, mostly one at a time, and lose most of their ammo and supplies in the process, while also having no way out. One of the soldiers who is seen as the weakest and least prepared becomes the hero they didn't know they had amongst their ranks. This description could be a ton of different movies and has been done to death.
Bobby?
Yeah.
Leave Doug alone. He's a Democrat. He doesn't believe in guns.
But are you really watching The Hills Have Eyes 2 for its stellar storytelling ability? As this team gets dwindled down and picked off, oddly enough with 2 of them being shot to death and 2 of them dying from falling, probably due to the budget, they enter a cave system that the original soldier told them about before he takes himself off the board for good. The caves are dark, again helping with the look of some of the stuff on screen, but also look pretty good and were designed by the same team that did the caves for one of my all-time favorites, The Descent. They slide down some tube tunnels and use up all their ammo while thankfully taking out a couple of the threats. Missy is kidnapped, and it's pretty clear that her, Amber, and Napoleon are going to be the final 3. That's exactly what happens after some gnarly fights and an ill-timed explosion. The final confrontation is a fun one, with all 3 of the remaining soldiers seeking revenge for either themselves in Missy's case, or for their fallen comrades in the case of Napoleon and Amber. Papa Hades is no pushover though, and he's able to toss them around like a parent playing with their toddlers. He can also take quite the amount of damage due to his being a mutant and all. They're able to stab him with a pole that feels reminiscent of the American flag kill from the first movie, but even that doesn't put him down for good. The bayonet sure does the trick, however. As most horror movies, and nearly all sequels, end though, our heroes make it out of the caves only to be spotted on repurposed military equipment used by mutants in another area of the desert. There would be no part 3, however, and that's a shame. While this movie probably isn't going to show up on anyone's favorite films of all time list, it could have continued the series on the direct-to-video market. Series like Hellraiser and Wrong Turn absolutely thrived in that arena, and these films could have churned out low-budget but consistently fun entries every couple of years. The Hills Have Eyes 2 doesn't belong where its critical score shelves it, nor where the fans discuss it. It has a lot of fun with the premise and makes good on what you'd expect to see. A good black sheep is one that defies its odds and labels to be something that makes you say, well, actually, when someone asks for a horror recommendation, particularly within an established series of films. Seek this one out any way you can and bask in the glory that is a schlocky sequel to one of our finest remakes.
Seems like the world is moving on. Didn't stop to look around. Didn't give a shit if you're crashing down. You can close your eyes but not your skin. Don't believe what you refuse to see. Won't find a way in. Well, I can't ignore a certain thing. The result of people fighting every day. Trying to find